welcome listeners to the true iteration of That's a Good Card. Today, Ya will have the challenge of getting me to say, "That's a good card." While Ya will be doing the convincing, I'll be playing the devil's advocate. Also, now's a good time to remind you to hit that subscribe button down below if you're listening to us on YouTube. And at the end of our video, stay tuned for our closing segment, Next Deck, where we talk about choosing our next decks to pilot. All right, Ya, let's get started. What have you brought to us today?
All right. I'm bringing a card that is seeing a little bit of play, but not as much as I would have thought, considering how powerful it is. And so I'm hoping to convince you all that this card can be a real political powerhouse. That's a bit of a hint here. So the card I'm talking about is called Breena, the Demagogue. She is one generic and then Orzhov. So white, black. One generic, white, black. She's a legendary creature, bird warlock. It has flying and 1 power, 3 toughness, and then a paragraph of text. All right, here we go. Whenever a player attacks one of your opponents, if that opponent has more life than another of your opponents, that attacking player draws a card and you put 2 +1/+1 counters on a creature you control.
Wow, that's confusing.
Yeah, I want to start off, but when I presented this card to Kyle, he told me, hey, I challenge you to simplify that. And so here is what I have come up with. So the best thing to think about when you're looking at this card, let's say I play out Breena. You as my opponent, you will now consider yourself in a 3-player game, right? When you're considering this card. Consider yourself in a 3-player game. If both of your opponents have more life than you, you will trigger Breena. Okay? If you have the most life of your 2 other opponents, you will not trigger Breena. If you are in between player A and player C, if you're in the middle of that life total, you will only trigger Breena once. Because I, as a player who casts Breena, am not going to trigger it. If you attack me, I am one of your opponents, but you have to attack one of my other opponents to trigger Breena.
Wow, that was still
day, right?
That was still so confusing.
So
this is
clear. So clear.
Yeah, I mean, this card, when I played my last paper event, this card by far was the card asked the classic. Can I read that card real quick? By far, it was not close. How many times people picked up this card from opponents and just asked to read it because damn, is this thing confusing. But yeah, basically it's like, I kind of like to think of it like the namesake. I actually really love the namesake of this card. Like calling Breena the Demagogue, it's like you're politically incentivizing other players at the table to beat each other up by giving the incentive of you can draw a card, right? So I think it's kind of interesting.
And you can draw up to 2 cards, right? If you have one of the lower life totals of the 2 people you're attacking, you get to trigger that twice. And all you're going to give me...
Yeah, if you got enough dudes to attack with, yes.
Right. And all you're going to give me is 2 +1/+1 counters, right? That's it. That's all it's going to give. Something we're going to start doing is just talking about some of the decks that we're seeing this played in Kenrith, Najeela, some Blue Farm, and then in a Sicily and Sofina deck that top 16 at Command Fest San Francisco. Props to that person.
Yep. Yeah, so this card's already seeing play. It's in quite a few really popular lists. I think it's in and out of a lot of the popular lists, which is why...
It is in more sideboards than it is
exactly,
in the main deck.
Which is why we thought that this was just a perfect card for us to bring up today. This is right up our alley of a fringe card that's running in and out of the sideboards. It's definitely one of the stronger cards that we've talked about, considering we see it in a lot of top 16 deck lists already from really strong lists. So yeah, I'm really excited to talk about this one today. Yeah, do you want to get into your points?
Yeah, so the reason I started running this in my own Najeela list after hearing about it, shout out to Lamora's Cards, was that this card basically helps my warriors or mana dorks in Najeela get around, hopefully, Orcish Bowmaster. So, and you're going to probably bring up like, hey, y'all, you're giving card draw to somebody else, which is going to ping your dorks or your warriors. You're right, but don't forget that in Magic, the ability has to resolve first before something else can happen, right? And so what I'm saying here is that you go to combat, we trigger Breena. Breena's trigger will, hey, if you're attacking somebody, this trigger is going to go on the stack. If it resolves, right, you're going to get to draw your card, but I also get to put my +1/+1 counters on there before Orcish Bowmaster's trigger will get to resolve.
Yeah.
So you're going to be slightly outpacing it, at least for a 1-for-1, right? So you're going to put a +1/+1, so it'll be a 2/2 before Orcish Bowmaster kind of gets a ping. I used it a lot to kind of protect Najeela, right? Najeela is a 3/2, so she's kind of susceptible to those slightly smaller dorks.
She can get bolted.
But she can get bolted, but like being able to give her 2 +1/+1 counters in one instance of like in one trigger of this is a pretty big deal.
Yep.
And in testing, more often than not, I can rely on somebody's greed to try to maximize how much card draw they're going to get, right? Because you can trigger Breena twice, which means that because if both of your opponents have more life than you, you're going to trigger Breena twice. You're going to get 2 cards out of this, and I will get 2 different instances or 4 +1/+1 counters altogether to kind of divvy up to 2 different creatures. And that can be a really big deal if you're playing. That's why I think you do see it in some Tymna Crom lists, is that all of a sudden some of the smaller creatures, or maybe even bigger creatures, like even like a Crom, become a much bigger beat stick.
Yep.
Right. Than you would normally see.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's pretty interesting to think about how, and we'll kind of get into this in the downsides, but how the biggest downside, obviously, of this card is that you're letting your opponents draw cards. But as a caveat, like the idea that one of the most prominent card draw punishers in Orcish Bowmasters doesn't really affect you when you're using this card, I think that's pretty interesting. I think the ability to buff up your own dorks does have some relevance. Or your own commanders, your fragile commanders like Najeela.
Or your Tymna, right? Like a Tymna is only a 2/2, and so she's pretty fragile. All of a sudden, Breena can kind of make her a bigger deal. Yeah, Breena herself can also get these counters, and so all of a sudden you have a
flying beat stick.
A flying beat stick. And the thing I've found is that, again, like, since everybody kind of wants card draw, once you pass a turn, everybody's going to probably try to get this to trigger at least once, right? And so now you have a format where in CEDH where we don't normally attack at each other, and people are now trying to like position themselves to get some more card draw. You're protected at least from some of that because they're not going to trigger if they're swinging into you.
Yeah.
You have your opponents attacking each other, and so my second point for this is a great card to run if you're trying to get yourself into a political footing and you don't know how, you're not the best socially, but like now you have a card that kind of starts conversation, right? And we've talked about the power of politics before. Yep. Is like, this is going to be a card that will teach you, for better or for worse, really quickly, how to start politicking, right? If you find yourself losing pretty badly because you gave away too much card draw or whatnot, like that's a spot that you can kind of start like going, hey, look, I think you need to be swinging into this person, right? Or like, and trying to like say like, I'm not the bad guy. Don't forget, I'm helping you get more card draw for this person. And yes, that could be a downside, but it's also, I think the word is catalyst for helping you kind of break into that political arena, right?
Yeah.
Like give yourself
a reason to start the conversation, even if that reason is just like, hey, don't forget to go to combat if you want to draw a card. Haha.
Right? Yeah. So that's my second point. And then my last point is just kind of around something we've already been kind of talking about before. And that's just like the power of combat, right? Mm-hmm. It is a step that we don't always see ourselves kind of going through. I think that a long time ago I read and heard that like sometimes it's best to just go into your turn, do your beginning untap upkeep, and sometimes just swing right away, right? Swing right away, and like I think Breena is a good reminder of doing that. Cards like this is good to remind you of like, hey, you also have to be really good mechanically at this game, right? And I think this is a good card to kind of remind you of like, hey, what are good magic mechanics here?
Yeah.
Right? It's not just the politics. You still want to have good control of like what you do technically.
Yeah, it's great to finally, have a card that's healthy for the format in a sense that we're reminding CEDH players that the combat step exists. I love that.
Yeah. Right, beyond Yuriko.
Yeah, exactly.
Or anything else, like
for all the CEDH decks that just like to play solitaire and never go to combat, this card will change things right here. Combat matters.
Combat definitely matters. And so, yeah, those are my 3 really simple points about why I think Breena deserves a little bit more love in the main deck rather than sitting in your sideboard.
Yeah, and I got one more point to throw at you that I saw. I like to, you know me, I like to think about like my Magic Christmas Dreamland for these cards.
Yeah.
And I think that there's a super high ceiling for this card with Smothering Tithe out, right? So that's where I've seen this card be the most successful, is when you have Breena out and you have a Smothering Tithe out, and you are politicking players to attack to draw cards, and then every time that they draw cards, you are getting treasures. So now Breena's giving you counters, and you're getting treasures from Smothering Tithe triggers. It's a wonderful place to be. In the same Magic Christmas Dreamland, you also have your own Orcish Bowmaster out, so every time they're drawing cards, you're laying out damage, and you're just getting all the possible benefits that you can from your opponent's drawing cards, right?
I agree. And then something I just thought about right now is I've had come up in one game. All of a sudden, with maybe one cycle of this card, and let's say you have, again, Magic Dreamland, Breena out, and an Esper Sentinel. All of a sudden, if you're just feeding your counters onto the Esper Sentinel, Esper Sentinel
huge.
basically now becomes
you can't pay
a
for
Mystic
it anymore.
Remora, right? Would you like to pay the 8?
Thickest Esper Sentinel in your Dreamland.
Right? Right, like it has come up in a game before where somebody just kind of fed their triggers onto
their Esper
Sentinel, and all of a sudden they're asking like, "Hey, do you want to pay the 7?" No, I can't pay 7 for this. You're gonna also get more card draws, right? Because you're in the right colors. You're protecting your Dranith Magistrate. You're protecting things.
Your own Orcish Bowmasters.
It really can matter.
And before I get into the downsides as well, I'll give a quick tip for those trying to pilot this card. This is all purely anecdotally of me seeing this card played and playing against this card. I think that the best route you can do when playing Breena, when placing your counters, is to spread them out and share the wealth. I think that what I've seen happen most and how to misplay this is just throwing all your counters on Breena, making it massive, and then somebody just swords it, right? Like, you want Breena to stay out. You want it to be under the radar. Like, you don't want people to assess Breena as a threat. And when you start stacking up fat counters on Breena instead of your other things on the board, it's not going to let you get the full value out of Breena. So I think generally speaking, Breena already has a big enough butt at 3 toughness. You don't really need to add counters to it. By adding counters to Breena when you have other options, you're just incentivizing your opponents to remove your value piece. So spread the wealth, share the wealth.
I agree.
I think that's the best way you can play this card.
Yeah, I agree. I think that it's gonna happen, right? In my experience, you're gonna all of a sudden have a board of dorks, and then all of a sudden, then like in one turn rotation, like again, it's gonna trigger more than I think people suspect, right? Like people are greedy. CEDH wants to draw cards,
No,
so you're banking on that. You're banking on them giving you these counters, and then the next thing, by the time you get back to your turn, you've got a couple of like from 1/1s up to 3/3s, some 4/4s, a 4/5, and like they made that happen, right? And now they do have to kind of like, you do want to spread it out if you can, because it'll get thick pretty quick.
Yeah, exactly. All right, I'm ready to get into my downsides, y'all.
The
first one is basically the most, like, it's the biggest elephant in the room here, and that's you're letting your opponents draw cards, right? And we talk about this.
Yep.
This is it's a trade-off card, right? You are giving up something to gain something. And what you're giving up is arguably the best thing to do in Magic the Gathering, which is draw cards.
You're not wrong.
I mean, it's really hard to justify playing a card that's going to let my opponents draw into their win cons or draw into answers for my win cons. That being said, I think that the only time that this card feels good when your opponents are drawing cards is what we mentioned before, when you're able to punish or tax their card draw. If you have your own Orcish Bowmaster out, or you have your own Smothering Tithe out, or you have a Fairy Mastermind out, something that's going to let you benefit from their card draw more, I think that that's where this card shines. If you are just throwing down a Breena raw and don't really have and don't really have a plan or any way to, progress your win condition through Breena, I think you're gonna have a bad time.
I agree.
But that's my first point. Second point, it's a weird color pip situation with Orzhov. You don't really see a lot of Orzhov cards. I mean, maybe Lotho. Other than that, like,
Lotho.
yeah, and Timna, I guess,
yeah.
of course, the commander. But it's kind of hard to find this color combination of pips. A lot of times, the 5-color good stuff decks, if they don't have like an early Esper in their hand or something like that, they're going to fetch for colors that aren't going to be white a lot of the times. But, it's just a weird color combination. So I think it's a very minimal downside. It's probably my weakest downside, but at the same time, it's still something to think about. If not a lot of your cards are going to be white or black pips, it's just something to consider, right?
Agreed.
Yeah. Would you say, I mean, yeah, you're the 5-color good stuff master. When you're playing a 5-color good stuff, like, do you think that, like, what color do you think is what you least have access to? Like, let's say in turns 2 and 3.
Shoot.
Like, maybe green is the lowest,
generally,
right?
Probably green, because I don't run too much green, even in my color.
Yeah.
But green is surprisingly also easy to get to in some capacity.
Uh-huh.
Honestly, sometimes it's white.
That's what I think. I think white
Right,
is definitely like the pip that it's tough to get to. Just because early on, like, you're searching for such like bombs, like a lot of times you're searching for a red pip so that you can play Dockside, or if you're playing Najila, you need that red pip, right? And I actually think blue is something that you normally go for in general, just in these decks, because you have so many of those 1-pip blue spells, right? That'll be in your hand. Like, you'll have a juicy starting hand, and then sitting in there is like a Spell Pierce or a Stern Scolding or whatever, There's some 1-pip blue spell to help you out. But yeah, just a weird pip combination.
Yeah, no, totally solid. I think it is, like, when I go fetch, I usually, in Najila, I generally will fetch for a Badlands first, right? And then generally also probably, or Underground Sea, right?
Yeah.
Because I'm probably trying to resolve a Mystic Remore or a Rhystic Study, right? Of some sort. So,
do you Volcanic Island often? For the red for Najila, and then blue for the fish or something like that?
I used to when I was first starting off with her, but more and more I find myself, if I'm going to do that, if I'm going to look for red, I'll probably grab a Badlands, because a Badlands gives me black for tutors.
I see.
Right? The better tutors.
That's true.
Right? Like,
Fair.
Blue is good, but it just depends on what I had to mulligan for.
Yeah, that's true. Whether or not you see that Esper in hand, whether or not you see that Dranith in hand early is basically the difference of whether or not you're even going to have a white pip available.
Agreed.
Cool. All right, let's go to my last downside, which is kind of something that we've slowly unpacked throughout this podcast, which is, like, it's hard for me to see the plan for this card, right? So, like, what plan are we going for when we are playing a card? That's one of the questions I ask myself when I build a deck, right? When I'm brewing, I'm like, okay, how does this card that I'm adding to my deck fit into my game plan? And I think we've slowly uncovered that, we're kind of going towards a beats plan, or kind of going towards maybe something that's dependent on counters being added. But other than that, it's really hard for me to find, like, where exactly, like, what path this card wants to take. Like, what are we trying to do with Breena? What value are we trying to pull from this card? And it's difficult to see what that is if you don't have the qualifiers of, well, you want to pair this with an Orcish Bowmaster, or, well, you want to pair this with a Smothering Tithe. So without those qualifiers, it's hard to see what you want this card to do. Maybe that just means that this is a, Swiss Army knife card and it can kind of pivot and go to different areas, or maybe it means that this card doesn't really have a game plan and it's more of just being there to provide value. I don't really know exactly what the path is for this card.
I think you're right. And I think this is why this card has struggled to find itself in the main and more inside the considering or sideboard, right? When you're looking for this card on Mox Field or on the top 16, I've seen it probably more in the considering pile. Like, it's like close, right? And they're keeping it there because, like, they want to consider it. But I definitely think of this card as, for me, more of like a value piece, right? And kind of to and I think the part of the problem with this card for you is, like, There's another card I really enjoy in terms of from Kinnan called Perplexing Chimera.
Yeah.
It just creates some havoc. It creates havoc.
It is. It's chaos.
Amongst the
It's
table,
chaos.
right? It's chaos, right? It really can kind of like all of a sudden you are like, and I think that's what I like it. It's a nice, it's a powerful political tool that you're kind of using like, hey, don't swing into me. And in this meta of Talions and Omnixiluses and Orcish Bowmasters where people are just kind of pinging you in the face, and our pod with Gearson Starn, right? Like I turned to this card as protection first, right? Some incidental value. And then if I'm playing in the right pod, it definitely is turning me into like, I'm just going to finish this game like casual commander plays. Like I'm just going to
beat people up
and hit you all.
Yeah.
I'm just going to beat people up. So you're right. It does struggle. And I think that's why in very clean cut decks like Timnacrom, right? Timnacrom just has like zero fat. It is a lean, mean machine now. And so I was actually surprised to even see it.
Yeah, fascinating that some of these.
Yeah,
it's crazy that some of the top 16 blue farm lists actually played it, just because it doesn't fit that lean, mean machine deck list like archetype. It's just a value engine. So I don't know. It's kind of interesting. I will say, I'll give credit, shout out again to Tyam, because I think this card's pretty nuts in Tyam, just because counters are pretty good.
Oh, yeah, so good. It's so good. You can pull it out.
Exactly. So, in Tyam, I love this card. I'll point that out right now. What I'm trying to say is, in counter-dependent decks like Tyam, this card fits into a path, right? It fits into a plan.
For sure.
It knows what it wants to do, and I really like that. For different deck lists that aren't counter dependent, jury's still out.
And I think that point right there is the point that I think you brought up that is the biggest downside for me, right? It's like it doesn't have quite a clear plan, right? In like my Najila, which is less good stuff now, is more of like my own kind of brew. I think that you bring out this card and that's what you're hoping to do is kind of create chaos, right? In other people's game plans. And I think that's why you see it in a blue farm, because everybody kind of knows what to expect in blue farm. And so I would imagine a player like that is slotting in these like pet cards or niche cards to kind of create like, we weren't expecting that out of blue farm, right?
Yeah,
like,
it's just throwing a wrench.
You're throwing
a wrench in the strategy too. It also probably helps differentiate the better blue farm pilots from the worst blue farm pilots, because the worst blue farm pilots might get really tripped up by this. So like if you're in a blue farm mirror matchup and you're running Breena and the other player isn't, they might be really confused as to what the hell's going on.
Yeah, what do you do right now? All of a sudden, like I can't swing my Timna into you
because your Timna's bigger than mine. Yeah, or like
right, like because like I have to focus you, but if I focus you, I won't get cards from your Breena, and so
you put him in a pickle.
And that's what I'm hoping. But at the same time, I think you bring up a really good point. Like that's the biggest downside to me is like there's no clear cut plan. It's a okay value piece, but it could be a great value piece for your opponent.
Yeah, so the best point that you made that really stuck out to me for this card is just how it makes combat important. And I love that shit. So I'm all for the health of CEDH being reliant on combat. I'm all for wanting to create threats on the board through damage. I love that shit. So I'm all aboard any card that's going to promote a good, healthy meta where combat's going to matter. And deciding who you're attacking and with what you're attacking matters. Like whatever makes that relevant, I'm down for.
Sweet. So with that, has your mind changed on Breena the Demagogue?
So I think so. I think that going into this, I already knew that this was a powerful card that had seen success in a lot of lists. It was kind of on the fence on a lot of lists of whether or not it should be included or not. I still have my same biases and reservations. I definitely do. But I think through our conversations and seeing the potential for this card in like the Dreamland scenarios, I think a smart pilot can use this card really, really well. So I'll go ahead and say it. Breena the Demagogue, that's a good card.
Nice. You heard it here, folks. Kyle said it himself. This is a good card.
I'm excited to see if more lists pick this card up. There's a lot of lists that could play this card, and a lot of lists that, don't play it or have tried it. So I'm interested to hear from people who have played it as well, or played a lot of it and took it out, or haven't played it and want to try it, and kind of just see what their thoughts are on this card. It is a really weird card, and I'm all for trying stuff that's a little, unordinary.
Out there. Yep.
Awesome.
All right, everyone. It's time for a segment called Next Deck. The goal of this segment is to get each other thinking about broadening our pilot pool, as well as getting you, the viewer, to join us in thinking about trying out a new deck list. I'll be presenting 2 meta decks to Kyle that I know he doesn't pilot, and we will hear his gut reaction into which he is more interested in.
All right.
You ready,
Yeah,
Kyle?
I'm ready for it. I always love me some next deck. I like thinking about what I want to play next, or thinking about, if I had the option between 2 decks and I want to try one of them, which one I'd pick. So hit me with them. What are my options?
Okay, I personally know that you don't run a Grixis deck, so I want you to consider the choices between Rogsai, obvious choice, or Tevish Crom.
Okay, so this one's going to be a slam dunk for me. I don't think it's going to be particularly close. I love turbo
I know what you're probably going to
decks.
say.
You know I'm going to say Rogsai. This is something that comes up every single tournament I have played. Someone will mention, like, oh, you're playing Corvold, it's a turbo deck, why don't you just play Rogsai? And to be honest, God, it gets, like, I get this much closer. I get a step closer anytime I lose to a Rogsai as Corvold, because they're just a little bit faster than me, and they just have better protection than me. I just, a part of me, my Jund soul crumbles. That being said, I definitely think it's an incredible deck. I think it's by far and away the best turbo deck in the format. So yeah, I'd probably go with Rogsai. I haven't seen a ton of Tevish Crom. I think it's kind of interesting to have 2 big old commanders and kind of play
card
yeah,
advantage.
exactly, and just kind of play a more mid-rangey style. It's interesting. The color combo's cool because Grixis is awesome, but I think that it's just a slam dunk for me that I want to go fast. I want to be, I want to finish the game in 25 minutes and then have 55 minutes to chill while the 80-minute timer runs out.
That's pretty nice. That is a big deal, I think, in tournaments for sure. I'm not too surprised. I kind of wanted to give you the option of Tevish Crom. Tevish Crom is Grixis good stuff, right? It's still a Grixis list,
Yeah,
but
it's a great list.
It can go more mid-rangey, right?
Yeah.
It can pivot, right? It can pivot, go fast, but it can also like kind of settle in with the commanders, right? Being a little bit more resilient, right? You're going to try to probably resolve Crom first and then get your Tevish out, and now you've got card draw on other people's turns as well as every other turn, basically being able to get more, up to 2 cards, right, through Tevesh.
Awesome. Well, great.
But I'm not surprised.
No surprises here. The turbo player.
Kyle goes
Yeah,
burr.
the turbo player wants to play an even faster deck. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of That's a Good Card. Today we brought you Breena the Demagogue. I hope you enjoyed it. Please don't forget to check out our link tree in the description down below. It has links to all of our social medias and all of the platforms that we stream this podcast on. Also, don't forget to interact with our comment section down below. Please let us know if you're trying Breena in a deck that we haven't listed today, or just your general thoughts about Breena in general.
Yeah, please. We love interacting with you all. I think that's been one of the biggest joys out of this for me. And so please let us know what you think, and we'll catch you on the next one.
Yeah, don't forget to like and subscribe, and have a great day. See y'all next week. Bye.
Bye.